The Cursed Heirloom. The day Baron Rowan Blackwood first set eyes upon Blackwood Keep, a bitter wind scoured the moorlands, and low clouds pressed so close it seemed the sky itself had sunk to envelop the ancient stones. The Baron had never seen the castle before. His father had exiled himself from this forbidding place well before Rowan was born. Now, as the carriage rattled along the narrow road, he couldn't help but feel both exhilarated and uneasy about his inheritance. He had expected to see a proud fortress perched upon a hill, defiant against the stormy horizon. Instead, Blackwood Keep rose from the ground like a stooped old man burdened by centuries of secrets. Its high walls and tall spires were tinted gray by neglect, and deep shadows clung to the cracks in the masonry. Rowan was a slight man of 25 years, with pale features accentuated by dark hair and watchful eyes. Despite his youth, life had already carved lines of quiet anxiety into his face. He had not, by any means, expected to inherit this estate so soon. Rumors had reached him in letters from distant relatives. His uncle had died suddenly, childless, leaving the title and the castle to Rowan, the only surviving male heir of the Blackwood line. The letter from the solicitors was curt and devoid of sentiment. "Present yourself at Blackwood Keep within 1 fortnight," it had commanded. Rowan had arrived scarcely an hour before the fortnight expired. At the iron gates, the carriage halted. A lone figure emerged from behind a series of twisted yew trees, an old steward wearing a threadbare tailcoat that might once have been as dignified as the castle. He introduced himself as Mr. Sykes. His voice trembled with equal measures of subservience and fear. Rowan attempted to exchange pleasantries, but Sykes seemed anxious to usher him inside, as if the very wind carried curses. And perhaps it did, for as Rowan entered the foyer, he felt a gust of cold air swirl behind him, as if the castle exhaled a long-held breath of dust and sorrow. Torch brackets lined the stony walls, but few were lit, and he could barely make out the high, vaulted ceiling far above. The marble floor beneath his boots was polished smooth, but bore the faintest traces of discoloration, water damage, or perhaps something far older. "Welcome to your ancestral home, my lord," Sykes intoned in a voice with no vestige of warmth. "I trust you had a safe journey." Rowan inclined his head, fatigue gripping him. "As safe as can be expected, old friend. I am glad to finally see this place, though I cannot claim it's as I imagined." "The keep has a way of exceeding expectations," Sykes responded, with the hint of a wry smile, an expression gone before Rowan could fully register it. "Let me show you to your chambers." Left alone, Rowan surveyed his new quarters. The canopy bed was enormous, its posts carved into the shapes of twisted vines and leering gargoyles. Heavy drapes of deep burgundy cloth hung from the canopy, one corner tattered and trailing on the floor. A carved mahogany wardrobe stood against the wall. A gilded mirror framed with coiling serpents faced the bed. The entire chamber carried the faint scent of damp stone, candle wax, and something indefinably old. He set down his travel bag and unlatched it, removing a brush, a plain black suit for dinner, and a leather-bound journal he used to record his private thoughts. As he passed the mirror, he caught a glimpse of his reflection, a slender man standing amid the relics of a darker age, eyes already bearing the weight of this bleak inheritance. With a small shiver, he looked away. As they walked the labyrinth of corridors, candlelight played upon time-worn tapestries that depicted hunts and battles from centuries past. One in particular caught Rowan's attention. It showed a figure wearing a ring with a large ruby set into black metal. Behind the figure, an army of shadows knelt as though swearing fealty, or perhaps they were cowering. "What does this tapestry commemorate?" Rowan asked, halting. Sykes hesitated before replying. "An ancestor of yours, Lord Cedric Blackwood. It was said he forged a great fortune and built the keep's eastern wing. The ring he wore became a symbol of this family's wealth and tragedy. The old steward's voice quivered on that last word. Intrigued, Rowan stepped closer. The figure in the tapestry had hollow eyes, and the ring on his finger glistened as if the embroidered ruby trapped a droplet of fresh blood. That ring, said Sykes after a tense moment, has been passed down from generation to generation. Locals speak of it as being cursed. Superstitious nonsense, of course. Of course, Rowan echoed, though his eyes lingered on the tapestry. Its artistry was so keen that he fancied he saw the ring's gem flicker with its own internal fire. They continued through hallways overrun by gloom until they reached Rowan's appointed bedchamber. Sykes opened a heavy oak door and bowed. If you require anything, ring the bell. Dinner will be served in an hour, in the main dining hall. Dinner in the great hall was a somber affair. Long tables stretched under a vaulted ceiling, painted with storm clouds and ravens. Only one table was set, a single place for Rowan, and a setting for Sykes to serve. Tall candelabras flickered with pale flames that did little to dispel the gloom. Rowan asked Sykes about the region, the harvests, the local tenants, but each question was met with sparse, measured responses. Perhaps the steward was merely shy. Rowan resolved not to press. Yet in the pit of his stomach, an unease churned. Once or twice, Rowan thought he heard footsteps in the corridor, but Sykes insisted they were alone, except for a few maidservants who had retired for the evening. Afterward, Sykes led him back to the bedchamber. Before withdrawing, he gave a slight bow and murmured, "If I may, my lord, do keep your door locked at night. The winter draughts can be quite fierce." He said no more, but the look in his eyes implied a warning that had nothing to do with cold air. That night Rowan lay awake long after the last candle guttered. The hush of the castle was even more profound now, interrupted only by creaks and groans of ancient timber. He tried to distract himself by reading an old ledger, but the cramped handwriting and archaic script made little sense. Sometime past midnight, a noise from the corridor wrenched him from his slumber. It was the shuffle of feet, many feet, and an echoing murmur of voices. The castle was supposed to be nearly empty, and the hour was far too late for normal activity. Heart-pounding, Rowan lit a candle. He slipped from his bed, stepping onto the icy floor. The sound grew louder, as if a crowd was marching through the corridors, chanting in a low monotone. His mind reeled. Who could it be? Soldiers, servants, thieves? He unbolted the door and peered into the hallway, holding the guttering flame high. The corridor was empty. Shadows wavered on the stone walls, and a chill wind licked at his bare feet, but no sign of living intruders could be seen. The chanting had faded, replaced by an even more unsettling silence. In the morning, Rowan found Sykes in the small breakfast parlor, quietly eating toast. The Baron hesitated. He did not wish to appear weak or superstitious, yet the disquieting events of the previous night could not simply be ignored. "Sykes," he began, seating himself across from the steward. "Were you awake late last night?" The old man looked up. "I was not, my lord. I bade you good night and retired. Is something amiss?" "I heard voices," Rowan said, uncertain how to phrase it. "A gathering, or chanting, in the corridor. Did any of the servants hold vigil, or prayers, or something of that sort?" The flicker in Sykes's eyes told Rowan the man knew exactly what he was referencing. Still, the steward's tone was careful. "No, my lord. The servants are quite devout, but none would linger in these corridors at night. They know better." Rowan's breakfast turned to ash in his mouth. "Know better?" Sykes lowered his gaze to his cup of tea. "Your father left these halls and never returned, my lord, because of the family's unfortunate heritage." The Blackwoods have always been rumored to carry a dark stain from centuries ago. Perhaps it is only old superstitions, but many a caretaker claims to see shadows or hear unholy chanting in these halls. And the ring? Rowan pressed, remembering the tapestry. The steward nodded gravely. It is said the ring is cursed, that each baron of the Blackwood line who inherits it is haunted by the ghosts of the family's wrongdoing. Whether that is literal or figurative, I cannot say. But local villagers speak in hushed tones of a curse that cannot be lifted. That afternoon, Rowan decided to explore the castle in daylight, determined to conquer his unease. Blackwood Keep included countless chambers, corridors, and hidden passages. Dust lay thick on most surfaces, as though entire sections had been abandoned for decades. He passed locked doors and came upon a gallery hung with portrait after portrait of grim-faced ancestors. Their eyes seemed to follow him with silent reproach. One painting featured a slight, severe woman in a black gown, the ring prominent on her finger. Her expression was so lifelike, Rowan half expected her to speak. The plaque read, Lady Constance Blackwood, 1642 to 1677. Below it, in smaller script, take heed of her fate. Soon he found himself in an older wing, where the walls bore mildewed plaster rather than stone. A pungent smell of decay hung in the air. At the end of the corridor was a locked door, more ornate than the others. Its brass handle had the crest of a raven in flight. When he tried it, it resisted. Sykes, appearing out of nowhere, startled him. The steward's voice came soft but firm. That leads to the crypt, my lord. It is tradition that only the head of the household may enter, and only on certain nights prescribed by custom. Is that so? Rowan asked with a frown. I believe I am the head of this household now. Sykes bowed, though his hands trembled. Of course. Then it is your right to possess the key, which you will find. He hesitated, as if uncertain whether to continue. You will find it in the old baron's study. But please, I beg of you, do not visit the crypt alone, especially not at night. In the baron's study, Rowan found a grand teak desk with brass fittings. A musty scent rose from the drawers as he opened them, rummaging among old keys, documents, and a scattering of quill pens. Eventually, he found a small metal lockbox stamped with the family crest. Inside lay a single large iron key. It was old, pitted with rust, and far heavier than its size would suggest. Alongside the key was a ring. The ring. Its band was black as night, shaped into knot-like whorls that enclosed a ruby the color of fresh blood. Even in the subdued light of the study, the gem glimmered with a malign brightness. It seemed to pulse in Rowan's hand, as though it had a heartbeat. He recoiled instinctively, but some perverse compulsion drew him to touch the ring. A wave of cold shot up his arm the instant his fingertips brushed the metal. A swirl of images, faces contorted by anguish, walls dripping with shadows, an underground chamber lit by flickering torches, flashed through his mind. He staggered back, nearly dropping the ring. Gasping, he forced himself to place the cursed heirloom back in the lockbox and slam the lid shut. Was this the source of the haunting presence he felt? A token of the family's storied cruelty, tainted by centuries of tragedy and violence. He locked the box again. If the ring was truly cursed, he would not let it ensnare him so easily. That evening, Rowan's sleep was disturbed once more. Phantom footsteps echoed in the corridor. A cold wind seemed to seep from beneath the door, though all the windows in his chamber were shuttered tight. Around midnight, just as he began to drift into uneasy slumber, a faint glow shone under the chamber door. He roused himself, candle in hand, determined to find a rational explanation. Stepping into the hallway, he was greeted by a ghastly procession. Figures in archaic clothing moved silently through the corridor, translucent bodies shimmering like pale moonlight on water. Their faces were drawn and bleak. Some wore armor stained with dark blotches. Others wore robes or gowns from centuries past. At the head of this spectral parade was a tall man in a doublet, a shining ring on his bony hand. Rowan froze, candle shaking in his grip, unable to believe his eyes. Each ghostly visage turned to regard him with silent condemnation. Their eyes were hollow, but the weight of centuries pressed upon Rowan's chest. The tall specter at the forefront spoke in a voice as cold as winter wind. "Heir of Blackwood, you bear our sins. The blood we shed stains your hands as well." A chorus of whispered voices replied, overlapping each other. "We are the ancestors. We have walked these halls in torment, awaiting atonement that never comes." The tall man lifted his hand, displaying the cursed ring. The ruby glowed with malignant light, reflecting in Rowan's wide eyes. "You have inherited what we could not purge," he said. "Either you break the chain of bloodshed or join us in eternal remorse." Rowan's mind reeled. "I want no part of this. Whatever crimes you committed, that is your burden," he choked out, stepping back. But the specters only drifted closer. One of them, a woman with a regal bearing, whispered, "No child of Blackwood is spared. Take up the ring, or it will claim you. Atonement requires sacrifice." In the following days, the ancestral specters showed Rowan visions more horrific than ever. He saw fields burned, villages pillaged by his family's men-at-arms. He saw lines of peasants forced to kneel before the Baron's seat of judgment, condemned to the gallows for trifling offenses. He saw secret dungeons beneath the keep, where screams reverberated off damp stone. By the time the hallucinations released him, his body was racked with tremors, and tears stained his cheeks. Panting, he whispered, "Why show me this? I cannot undo what was done." A voice, deep and resonant, answered from behind him. When Rowan turned, he saw a middle-aged man with a stern face, a ghost from the family portraits. "You share in our blood," intoned the specter. "Our sins cling to your soul. You shall be judged by the same law. Choose redemption or damnation." "Redemption," Rowan croaked. "I want to atone. Tell me how." The specter gestured with an icy hand, indicating the ring. "Reclaim the heirloom. Bear witness to the truth in the crypt. Only there can the final judgment be passed." Rowan felt a renewed surge of dread. But he could not live under nightly assault from these phantoms forever. He would go mad. Resolving that he had no choice, he rose on unsteady legs. "Very well," he said. "I will face whatever lies below." He retrieved the cursed ring from the lockbox in the study. The moment he touched it, the gem flared red, and a chorus of ghostly voices swirled around him, though no specters were visibly present. The ring felt cold to the touch, its metal biting into his skin. Against his better judgment, Rowan slipped it onto his finger. Immediately, a jolt of pain shot through his arm, traveling up to lodge like a spike of ice in his chest. He staggered, bracing himself against the desk. Sweat slicked his brow. He felt the ring's weight like a shackle. Even so, he mustered his courage and headed down the corridor to the locked crypt door. With trembling hands, he fit the iron key into the lock. It turned with a loud groan of protest, the mechanism stiff from disuse. The door creaked open. A wave of dank air rushed out, carrying the stench of earth and decay. Candlestick raised, Rowan descended into the crypt. The stairs spiraled down into blackness, carved from the same stone as the castle's foundations. Flickers of candlelight revealed half-effaced carvings on the walls. Ravens, skulls, runes Rowan could not decipher. At last, he reached a broad vault. The ceiling soared above in a dome of intricately wrought stone arches. Rows of sarcophagi lined each side, their lids bearing carved effigies of long-dead Blackwoods. In the center of the crypt lay a sunken chamber, ringed by tall pillars. At the far end, an ancient altar stood, draped with moldy cloth. Rowan's footsteps echoed in the stillness. Drip by drip, water seeped from the walls, forming dark puddles. He advanced cautiously toward the altar. A presence enveloped him, like 1,000 eyes bearing witness from behind every pillar, every tomb. The ring on his finger throbbed, pulsing in time with his racing heartbeat. A whisper came from the darkness. "Kneel, child of Blackwood." Slowly Rowan lowered himself to his knees before the altar. He felt a cold gust swirl around him, extinguishing his candle. In the sudden dark, the ruby glowed on his hand with unnatural radiance. "You come seeking atonement," hissed a voice. "The spirits of the slaughtered cry out for recompense. Will you offer your life, your soul, to break the chain of bloodshed?" Rowan swallowed hard. I offer what is necessary," he whispered, though the words terrified him. In answer, shapes flickered at the edges of his vision. Ancestors, each wearing the ring in their era, each presiding over fresh horrors. They circled around him, silent but for the rustle of spectral garments. A single figure parted from the circle. It was a woman, her face half-veiled in tattered lace, eyes hollow. She reached toward Rowan's hand, her touch colder than ice. In the gloom, her voice resonated. "If you would redeem us, if you would end our torment, spill your blood upon the stone, renounce the ring, and stand in judgment." Summoning every ounce of will, Rowan rose. His legs shook. The ring's glow intensified until it hurt his eyes to look at it. The ancestors' ghosts crowded closer. Finally, he pressed the blade's tip to his palm. With a grimace, he drew a shallow cut. Blood welled, a dark rivulet in the ruby glow. "I renounce this cursed legacy. Let this blood pay for the sins of the Blackwoods," he cried out. A great wind swept the crypt, swirling dust and dead leaves in a vortex. The ghosts wailed in unison, a chorus of agony that deafened Rowan. The ring burned his skin. He saw with horror that it was sinking into his flesh, as though the metal softened and fused with his finger. Then suddenly, silence. When the swirling debris settled, the crypt was dark once more, save for the dim flicker of the ring's ruby. Rowan opened his eyes. The ghosts were gone. He stared at his hand. The ring sat loosely on his finger, no longer fused with his flesh. Had he succeeded? He stepped closer to the altar, candle relit. Before he could lay the ring down, a sharp crack rent the air. The stone floor behind him split, and a thick swirl of darkness emerged, coalescing into a monstrous shape. Vaguely manlike, it towered over him, featureless save for 2 pinpoints of crimson where eyes might be. "No penance can erase centuries of cruelty. Your blood alone cannot pay the debt," it roared. Desperate, Rowan cried, "Then take my life, if that is your price. But spare future generations. Let the innocent go free." The entity laughed, a hollow sound that rattled the crypt's columns. "You would offer yourself so readily. Then know that your sacrifice shall be but one more link in the chain." Tendril-like shadows lashed out, snuffing Rowan's candle. In the blackness, icy coils wrapped around his arms and throat. He gasped, choking as the ring's ruby flared. The last thing he felt before he lost consciousness was the ring tightening on his finger, dragging him downward. At dawn, a detachment of soldiers, summoned by rumor of the new Baron's distress, arrived at Blackwood Keep. Sykes greeted them with hollow eyes. "My master is in the crypt," he told the captain of the guard, voice trembling. He went there last night. He has not returned. Lanterns held high, the soldiers descended the winding stairs into the crypt. Their boots echoed in the silence, accompanied by the faint drip of moisture from overhead. Rows of sarcophagi loomed on either side. Some of the men crossed themselves, unnerved by the oppressive atmosphere. At length, they reached the central vault. The lanterns illuminated a chilling tableau. The altar stood empty, its surface dusty and unmarked, as though untouched for ages. Scattered about the floor were footprints, still fresh in the dust, footprints that led nowhere. And in one corner, half hidden by a broken pillar, lay a skeleton slumped against the wall. Tattered clothing clung to its bones, the fabric still bearing the crest of House Blackwood. Atop one bony finger, a ring glinted with an unholy light. Black metal around a blood-red ruby. One soldier bent to examine the remains, then recoiled with a startled exclamation. The skeleton was far too fresh. Bits of ragged flesh still clung to it here and there, though the face was unrecognizable. Where is the Baron?" another soldier muttered, eyes wide. But in their hearts, they suspected the truth. The ring's presence marked this skeleton as the Baron's final resting place, cursed to decay instantly upon the altar of his ancestral sins. Though the soldiers searched the crypt, the castle, and the grounds, no living trace of Baron Rowan Blackwood was ever found. It was as if he had been swallowed whole by the darkness. More rumors spread among the villagers. They said the Baron had tried to confront the curse, only to be claimed by the same black legacy haunting his lineage for centuries. Yet the ring remained, eternal, unyielding, still clinging to that bony finger in the crypt. No one dared remove it. In hushed tones, the people spoke of how another unsuspecting heir would one day inherit Blackwood Keep. Another soul would bear the cursed heirloom, haunted by the ghosts of centuries-old atrocities. Some nights, villagers claimed to see a solitary shape wandering the castle ramparts, a spectral figure dressed in tattered finery, the ring's ruby glowing in the gloom. Perhaps it was Rowan, trapped in the eternal gloom of his ancestors. Perhaps it was another shade altogether, mocking the living with the knowledge that no mortal could escape a fate sealed by centuries of evil deeds. Whatever the truth, Blackwood Keep stood silent and grim, overshadowed by a nameless dread. The crypt below waited, cradling the remains of the Baron among the countless bones of his forebears, all bound together by the cursed heirloom that knew no master, only victims. In the end, the ring was the one constant in the family's saga of blood and sorrow, an unbroken chain linking generations of the accursed Blackwood name. And within those dark halls, the phantoms would continue to roam, reminding all who ventured near that some sins demand a price far beyond mortal reckoning. The end.